While I was at my father's funeral, my mother handed out invitations to her wedding. "It's next week," she said. "Everyone's invited. Except him." She pointed at me. 2 months later, the venue canceled the booking because I bought the whole place. I didn't go looking for revenge. It came to me somewhere between the third voicemail my mother left after I ruined her dream wedding and the text message from my cousin that simply read, "Marissa, she's never going to forgive you for this. I hope you know that." Good. Let me explain. It all started at my father's funeral. That's where everything boiled over, where years of quiet bitterness and cold shoulders between my mother and me finally turned into a spectacle. A public fracture, in front of friends, family, and people who had probably only known me as Russell Langford's daughter or the one who runs those antique bookshops in Boston. But what my mother did wasn't just a betrayal. It was humiliation with purpose. She planned it. She waited for the moment I was at my most raw, most exposed, to deliver the final cut. We weren't close, my mother and I. Irene Langford is the kind of woman who wears resentment like perfume, subtle to others, but suffocating when you're close enough. She always saw me as some meek, sentimental shadow of my father. A distraction. Maybe even a rival. My father was the glue between us. After he passed, there was no buffer left. So at his funeral, while guests stood under gray clouds, offering quiet condolences and clutching tissues, she stood near the parking lot with a flute of champagne, smiling and handing out wedding invitations like she was the host of some exclusive garden party. "My wedding's next Saturday," she said casually to a stunned crowd. "Everyone's invited, except Marissa." She said it with a smile. Not cruel, not loud, but clear. There was a pause. A few awkward laughs, like people weren't sure if they'd misunderstood. But I hadn't. She looked me straight in the eyes and said it again, louder this time. "Except her." Then she turned back to a group of her friends and resumed chatting like she hadn't just exiled her only child from her upcoming nuptials at her dead husband's funeral. The rage didn't come right away. First came the disbelief, then the dull ache behind my eyes, and finally a sort of clarity I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just pettiness. It was planned. Purposeful. Calculated cruelty. But here's the thing my mother didn't know: I'd just inherited a large part of my father's estate. What she did that day wasn't just a power play, it lit a fire in me. And I had the means to do something about it. The invitations were thick, cream-colored, printed in gold leaf with embossed calligraphy. I found one tossed on a table at the wake. I read it, not because I cared about the details but because I needed to know where. The Winslow Estate, Kennebunkport. A historic seaside venue, the kind of place that's booked 2 years in advance and hosts magazine-worthy weddings with cliffside views and old money charm. I'd been there once, for a fundraiser. It was beautiful. Expensive. Exclusive. I don't know what compelled me to look into it further. Curiosity, maybe. Or maybe I wanted to see just how far she was willing to go to erase me from the image she was trying to build of her new life. What I found changed everything. The Winslow Estate had been quietly listed for private investment. Not public knowledge, just word of mouth in certain real estate and preservation circles. And thanks to the network I'd built through my bookstore partnerships, I was in one of those circles. Within 2 weeks, I had papers drafted. A controlling interest. My name, quietly attached through a trust. The deal closed. It wasn't cheap. But it was worth it. 3 days before her wedding, I made a single phone call to the estate's director. I didn't need to explain much, just that the new ownership was suspending private events for March. They'd need to cancel the wedding. No exceptions. She called me that night. I didn't answer the first time. Or the second. By the third time, I figured I should at least hear her voice one last time before blocking her. I didn't say anything when I picked it up. I just let her speak. "You think this is funny? Do you think this makes you a better person?" Her voice cracked not with sadness, but with pure, distilled rage. Do you think your father would be proud of this? Is this what you've become? Some bitter, spiteful girl playing rich with his money? Still, I didn't say anything. The silence on my end made her angrier. You're pathetic, Marissa. I hung up. I haven't spoken to her since. The wedding still happened, but not at the Winslow estate. Not with the sweeping ocean views and luxury catering and handcrafted floral arches. They scrambled and ended up at a community center in Saco. My cousin Cheryl sent pictures of fluorescent lights, folding chairs, crepe paper streamers, and a cake that looked like it had been picked up from a grocery store fridge an hour before the ceremony. She looked furious in every picture. Like she'd been robbed. And I guess, in a way, she had been. Robbed of the fantasy she built, the one where I no longer existed. Where she could reinvent herself without the burden of my father's legacy or my presence. The irony is, the Winslow estate didn't go to waste. I turned it into something new. After the call, I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time, just listening to the tick of the antique wall clock my father had restored himself. I didn't feel triumphant. Not exactly. There's something strange about revenge, even when it's clean, even when it doesn't hurt anyone beyond bruising an ego. It doesn't bring peace, not at first. It just rearranges the silence. Where there used to be confusion and longing, now there was distance. Cold, decisive distance. That night, I pulled out an old photo album from my living room bookshelf. It had been years since I'd touched it. Inside were photos of birthdays, holidays, and a version of my mother that no longer existed. There was one in particular, me at around 11, missing front teeth and holding a ginger cat in my lap while my parents stood behind me. My father's hand rested protectively on my shoulder. My mother's smile was perfect, but her eyes were somewhere else. Maybe they'd always been. In the weeks after the wedding disaster, I didn't hear from her. Not a call, not a text, not even the second-hand gossip she usually filtered through distant relatives. Just quiet. An unfamiliar kind of quiet. But from others? Oh, the messages came. Cheryl called to tell me how my mother showed up to the Saco Community Center wearing her custom-designed gown and demanded they redecorate using materials from a nearby craft store. She looked like a queen in exile, Cheryl said. People were whispering. Some of them knew it was you who bought the venue. You should have seen her face. I stayed silent. She's never going to forgive you. She's never liked me, I said simply. Then came the questions. Why did you do it? Wasn't there another way? Don't you think that was a bit harsh? Maybe. But no one had asked what she did to deserve it. They hadn't seen her walk up to me at my father's burial and toss me away like I was some embarrassing ex she'd finally cut out of her life. They hadn't lived in my skin for 42 years of subtle exclusion, of disapproving glances and long silences at family dinners. They didn't know what it felt like to sit at your father's bedside in his final days while your mother spent the nights at a hotel for her sanity, or how she referred to his cancer diagnosis as the end of the inconvenience. No. I didn't feel harsh. I felt done. Still, I knew she'd come back eventually. And I was right. 3 weeks after the wedding, I received a handwritten envelope. Cream paper. Gold embossing. Her stationery. Always dramatic. Inside was a single sentence, "You should be ashamed of yourself." That was it. No name. No greeting. Just that. I stared at it for a long time. Then I folded it neatly and tucked it in the back of my filing cabinet under miscellaneous. Around the same time, I started getting calls from the Winslow Estate's event coordinator, Ava, who had become something of a quiet ally during the whole ordeal. "You're kind of a legend," she said during one call, half laughing. I didn't mean for it to become a soap opera. It's New England. Everything's a soap opera here. We talked more after that about the house, the plans. I told her I didn't want the property to sit empty. My original idea had been to use it for personal retreats, maybe the occasional fundraiser in my father's name. But the more we talked, the more the idea grew. I want to build something that doesn't need to be about her, I said one evening over coffee. I want to make something meaningful. A space for women to create. Think. Breathe. Ava loved the idea. So we started drafting. Workshops. Writers' residencies. Art retreats. Even small wellness events for women-owned businesses. It felt good, like clearing old brush to make way for a garden. Like I was finally putting all the energy that had been consumed by bitterness into something that gave back. And maybe, in a quiet way, I was honoring my father. He loved beauty. He loved preservation. He believed in the strength of quiet people doing thoughtful things. The irony doesn't escape me. In trying to erase me from her new life, my mother had only pushed me towards something fuller. Bigger. She thought she'd cast me out. All she did was give me permission to build something on my own terms. But not everyone let it go. I started to notice more tension within the family. Old aunts who used to send me holiday cards stopped. My mother, I learned, was spinning a story that I'd hijacked her wedding out of spite, that I was unstable, selfish, and jealous. It didn't matter. The people who knew me didn't believe it. The ones who did never really knew me to begin with. The funny thing is, even after all of it, the wedding, the fallout, the gossip, a part of me still felt this tug. Like I owed her something. An explanation? An apology? Closure? It lingered, even though I knew better. That's the thing with mothers, isn't it? Even when they've let you down, there's this quiet ache. A part of you is always hoping to be chosen. To be enough. I told myself I was over it. But I wasn't. Not completely. And then came the fundraiser. A gala event at the Winslow estate. Our first. Invitations sent to old clients, artists, donors, historians. An elegant evening. Soft jazz, wine, a showcase of the renovations. And, somehow, an RSVP. From her. The envelope came through the usual pile of mail we sorted for the event. I wasn't even the one who opened it, Ava did. Marissa, she said, holding up the card between two fingers like it might bite her. I turned from my desk and took it. Thick cardstock, monogrammed with the gold IL she always used. Irene Langford. My mother. I stared at it for a long moment before opening. A simple RSVP. I will attend. Alone. No note. No flourish. Just confirmation, like this was the Met Gala and not the first time she'd set foot on the property she thought she'd be married at before I pulled it out from under her. She's not coming, I said aloud, placing the card back on my desk. You sure? Ava asked, looking uneasy. She just wants me to think she is. This is psychological warfare. A message. A warning shot. But I wasn't sure. Part of me was convinced she was bluffing. It was just another way to stir the pot, to remind me she could still push buttons without showing up. But another part of me, the part that still flinched when my phone rang unexpectedly, knew better. Irene Langford didn't bluff. The night of the fundraiser arrived like thunder wrapped in silk. The Winslow estate had never looked better. Candles and antique sconces, violinists in the drawing room, a guest list of New England's quiet elite artists, philanthropists, professors, even a local congresswoman. The smell of rosemary and roasted squash floated through the hallways. For the first time in a long time, I felt proud. Then, just past 7:30 p.m., I saw her. She came alone. Of course she did. My mother swept into the foyer in a navy silk gown, vintage fur thrown carelessly over one shoulder, a smile fixed tightly on her face like a woman who's trained herself not to show discomfort even when she's wearing shoes that pinch. Heads turned. Not because people didn't recognize her, but because they did. She belonged to another world, the kind of woman who always carried the scent of old money and entitlement. The kind of woman who made everything about her without ever raising her voice. And here she was. In my house. I didn't approach her. Not right away. I watched her from the corner of the main room while she sipped wine and casually observed the art hanging in the hall, pieces donated by the women attending the workshops we'd launched in the past few weeks. Ava found me by the staircase, where I'd been gripping the rail a little too hard. "Are you okay?" she whispered. "No," I replied. "But I'm not leaving." It took over an hour before we finally came face to face. I'd been doing the rounds, greeting donors, thanking guests, smiling like everything was fine. Then I turned, and there she was. Standing in the library. The same room where, just weeks ago, I had sat with the real estate attorney and signed the documents that made this property mine. She turned toward me, wine glass in hand, her head slightly tilted. "You've done well for yourself," she said softly. I waited. "I must admit," she continued, walking the edge of the room, fingers trailing along the spines of old books, "I didn't think you had this in you." Still, I said nothing. "You didn't have to humiliate me," she said. "You could have just told me how you felt. You could have not handed out wedding invitations at Dad's funeral," I replied calmly. Her expression didn't change, but I saw the faintest flicker in her eyes. A shift. "That was unfortunate," she murmured. "But symbolic. Necessary, maybe." "For who?" "For both of us." That stopped me. She turned to face me fully now. "You always thought I was cold, distant." "I suppose I was. But you were always your father's daughter. He loved you more than he ever loved me. You know that, right?" I didn't respond. Not because I disagreed, but because it was the first time she had said it out loud. "I spent years resenting you for it," she added, almost like a confession. "I didn't even understand why at first. You were a child. But every time he looked at you, I saw a softness in him he never gave to me." I stood perfectly still. The room felt tighter, like the walls were listening. "And when he died," she continued, voice even quieter now, "I suppose I wanted to remind you and everyone else that I was still here. That I could still take center stage." "You didn't have to erase me to do that," I said. "But it was the only thing I knew how to do." For a long moment, we just stood there. And then I said the only thing that felt true in that moment: "You're standing in a place you tried to take from me. And you're a guest now." She stared at me. There was no rage in her. No tears. Just the understanding that something had shifted, maybe forever. She placed her wine glass on the nearby desk, turned slowly, and walked out of the room. I didn't follow her. I didn't check to see if she stayed or left the estate after that. I just walked back into the crowd, thanked another donor, complimented someone's earrings, and kept my hands steady. But inside? Inside, I was still that daughter who once desperately wanted to be seen. And now, for the first time in my life, I was. She didn't stay long. When I later checked the guest list log, I saw her name marked as arrived but not departed. She hadn't signed out. Typical. Even her exit was meant to be ghost-like, a dramatic mystery she left behind like perfume on a scarf. The next morning, I found the wine glass she left behind in the library. I held it for a second longer than I meant to, then passed it off to Ava without a word. She didn't ask. She just nodded and took it to the kitchen. After the fundraiser, I didn't hear from her again. No calls. No texts. No passive-aggressive holiday cards. Nothing. But I kept getting news from Cheryl and others who still floated around in my mother's orbit. The new marriage? Already tense. Apparently, Conrad wasn't thrilled with how much she'd spent on the wedding that never happened. He'd tried to argue that her insistence on a last-minute venue proved she was more invested in appearances than in the marriage. Funny, I thought. That was always who she was. He just finally saw it. There were talks about money. Investments she wanted to make. Trips she'd planned without consulting him. He didn't like it. He started pulling back. My mother, ever the strategist, tried to throw dinner parties to keep up the illusion. People attended, but fewer each time. Conrad stopped posting pictures of her altogether. I heard quietly, through a friend of a friend, that they were now living mostly separate lives under the same roof. I wasn't surprised. You can build a life on ashes, but it'll never smell like home. Meanwhile, the Winslow estate flourished. I don't say that to be smug. I say it because finally, something I built out of pain was doing good. Tangible good. We launched our Quiet Women residency in June, a 10-day retreat for women who had been silenced in some way, by family, by culture, by their own self-doubt. The stories I heard around the breakfast table? They made my own drama with my mother feel almost distant. Universal, even. One woman had left an emotionally abusive husband after 30 years. Another was trying to rediscover who she was after her kids moved out. One woman came after surviving a near-death experience and decided she wanted to start painting again. They filled the estate with quiet fire. With healing. With art and essays and poems and stories scribbled in leather journals by the window seats I'd once curled up in as a girl. Irene Langford may have tried to erase me from her narrative, but I had written a new one that didn't include her at all. Then, in late October, something strange happened. A delivery arrived at the estate. Not addressed to me personally, but to the owner. No return address. No note. Inside was a box of old books. All classic literature. All first editions. On top of the stack, Wuthering Heights, one of my father's favorites. I opened it. Inside the cover was a nameplate, to RL, for when the wind feels too loud. IL. It was from decades ago. A gift from her to him. I stood there for a long time, fingers on the inscription, unsure what this meant. Was it her way of saying sorry? Was it a final olive branch? Or just another ghost? I didn't know. But I placed the book on the mantel in the library, the same one where we'd had our final conversation. Not as a tribute to her, but to him. The man who raised me gently in a house that was always a little too cold. The man who listened, who saw me, who never used silence as a weapon. He never got to see what I built. But I like to think he would have been proud. And me? I sleep well now. There's a kind of quiet that comes after the storm, not because everything is perfect, but because you finally stop trying to be heard by people who only ever listen to the version of you they wanted to believe in. She's still out there, somewhere, living her curated life. And I'm here, in a space I made with my own two hands. She pointed at me once and said, "Everyone's invited, except her." Well, now? She's not invited. Not to my table. Not to my peace. Not to my future. And I'm finally okay with that.